Welcome back. So, in the last lecture, we established what environmental justice is and why it matters. Now we're going to complicate things more. Okay. So, the question is, can you be a conservationist and environmental justice advocate at the same time? 10 years ago, most people in either camp would have probably said no. But today, the answer is shifting. I can say that I'm a person who considers myself a conservationist and an environmental justice advocate. But again, the tensions are real and it matters for this course. And as we unpack both topics and understand how they connect. So, in this lecture, we are going to explain why two movements that in some ways should be natural allies have historically been at odds in many ways, where they overlap and where they continue to clash, right? Again, this is not ancient history. These tensions are playing out right now in policy debates, funding decisions, and on the ground in communities around the world. So let's start with the movements and how they developed separately in the first place. So the American conservation movement emerged in the late 1800s from a particular class of people. It was wealthy white men who could afford to recreate in wild spaces. Think of John Muir, Theodore Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, right? Their concern was protecting wilderness from industrial development and creating national parks. Noble goal, right? But it came with some serious blind spots. Environmental justice emerged nearly a century later from a completely different place. Communities of color and low income communities fighting toxic waste, as we mentioned, right? But notice the difference. Conservation focused on protecting nature from people, environmental justice focused on protecting people from environmental harm and the harms of their environment. One centered wilderness, the other centered communities. One was largely white and affluent, and the other one was diverse, predominantly people of color, working class. Again, this is not just about different priorities. Early conservation actively harmed people, as we're going to explain. The creation of national parks displaced indigenous communities. Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier National Park, they all involved removing Native Americans, people who have lived on and managed those lands for millennia. When conservationists said pristine wilderness, they meant land emptied of people. And that is a fundamental conflict with justice. And again, the core tension here is different lenses, different questions, right? These movements developed from different analytical frameworks because they're solving different problems, right? I'm not equating that these are exactly the same. Conservation biology asks questions about carrying capacity, trophic cascades, habitat fragmentation, extinction risk, right? It focuses on ecological systems and often treats human presence as a disturbance variable that needs to be minimalized. I mean, the ideal state in much of conservation thinking is wilderness, defined as untrammeled by humans. Environmental justice asks who has power, whose health matters, who makes decisions, who pays costs. It's explicitly political and focused on equity. The ideal state is fair distribution of environmental benefits and burdens across all communities. But again, this creates real friction. Conservation project might succeed in protecting a watershed, but fail completely on justice metrics if it excludes local communities from resource access or decision making. An environmental justice project might successfully reduce pollution exposure for a community, but have no net benefit for the ecosystem health if it just shifts the pollution elsewhere. For decades, these frameworks have often operated in parallel. Conservationists worked in parks and protected areas, and EJ advocates worked in urban neighborhoods and industrial zones. They rarely intersected, and when they did, it was often adversarial. Let's be specific about some of these clashes. Fortress conservation, which we've discussed already, is one of the most obvious. This is the model where you draw a line around an area, you call it protected, and you restrict human activity. Sounds good for nature. But across Africa and Asia, an estimated 14 million people have been displaced by protected areas since 1990. That's not a side effect, right? That's the model. That's recent. The Maasai in Tanzania, facing eviction from ancestral lands to expand the Serengeti National Park and create a tourism corridor. The Baka people in Cameroon, arrested and beaten by eco guards for hunting in forests they've inhabited for thousands of years. Well, they're now designated as protected areas. Again, this is not colonial legacies. This is happening right now. Green grabs are the contemporary version. Conservation organizations, often with good intentions, acquire land for protection. But what if that land is community territory, even if not formally titled? That's displacement. Research by Nancy Peluso and others have documented how conservation projects in Southeast Asia have transferred control over millions of hectares of communities to states and non-governmental organizations like WWF, Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS. But then there's a really important question around livelihoods. Conservation restrictions often fall heaviest on the poorest. A ban on fishing in a marine protected area, it might inconvenience a recreational angler, but devastate a fishing family with no alternatives. A restriction on forest resource use might be fine for people with other income options, but catastrophic for indigenous communities dependent on those resources for their survival. Decision making power is a persistent friction as well. Conservation projects are typically designed by scientists and NGO professionals in faraway capital cities, or Western headquarters in North America or Europe, and they're implemented in communities. That's a top down model. EJ demands the opposite, community driven processes where affected people have genuine decision making authority, the ability to say no, not just consultation. Follow the money as well. Global conservation funding exceeds 10 billion annually. Environmental justice groups, particularly those led by communities of color, struggle to secure basic operating funds. The Nature Conservancy has an endowment of over 6 billion US dollars. Most grassroots environmental justice organizations operate on a budget under 100,000 USD annually. This funding gap really reflects whose concerns are valued and who holds institutional power. Lastly, epistemology is really important and a topic we're going to go over a lot in this course. Conservation is historically privileged these so-called Western scientific expertise, knowledge, academic knowledge. Like if you don't have peer-reviewed publications, your observations about ecosystems, well, they aren't considered credible evidence in many spaces. This is systematically devaluating traditional ecological knowledge held by indigenous and local communities who often have centuries of observational data about species behavior, climate patterns, and ecosystem dynamics. And so, where, if this sounds like a complete opposite, can we find synergies? How can we flip this, right? There's substantial common ground. Both movements oppose destructive industrial activities. When a mining company wants to tear up a mountain, both conservationists and EJ advocates are fighting that, right? Though for different immediate reasons. One because of habitat destruction, the other because of water contamination and health impacts on communities. But the opponent in the situation is the same, and the coalition potential is real. Climate change has forced a lot of convergence. You can't address climate without addressing both conservation and justice. Protecting forest stores carbon and preserving biodiversity, right? But it also protects indigenous territories and community resources. Climate justice demands we ask who caused emissions, who suffers first and the worst from the impacts, and who should control adaptation resources. That's an EJ framework applied to a conservation imperative. Community-based conservation represents a practical synthesis. There's now substantial evidence that conservation outcomes are better when local communities have management authority and benefit from protection. A meta-analysis by Porter Bolland in 2012 found that community-managed forests had lower deforestation rates than government-protected areas across Latin America. It's not just nice in theory. It's not just a nice story. It really works. Indigenous territories cover about 28% of Earth's land surface, again, but contain 80% of the remaining biodiversity. That's not a coincidence. Indigenous peoples have been managing ecosystems for a millennia, doing a damn good job at it. The best conservation outcomes globally are on indigenous lands, and the worst conservation injustices have often occurred when indigenous people are excluded, evicted from their territories. That's a data point that should reshape the entire field. Both movements critique the same underlying system. Conservation challenges the assumption that nature is infinitely exploitable for profit. EJ challenges the assumption that some communities are sacrifice zones for others' benefit. Both are critiquing extractive capitalism and demanding different relationships between humans, economies, and the environment. Let's ground this in a real example. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, or Y2Y, which was launched in 1997, has the goal of maintaining and restoring wildlife habitat connectivity from Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming all the way to the Yukon in northern Canada. That's 2,000 miles or more. Now, from a conservation biology perspective, this makes perfect sense. Large carnivores like grizzly bears and wolves, they need huge ranges. Habitat fragmentation is a major extinction risk, and creating connected corridors allows that genetic flow and population resilience to improve, and the science is solid. But look at this through an EJ lens, and questions emerge immediately. Well, whose lands are we talking about? The corridor crosses territories of multiple indigenous nations, including the Blackfeet, Kutsnakas, Wempek, and many others. Were they equal partners in designing this initiative from the start? Not really. Initial planning was driven by conservation scientists and large NGOs. Indigenous involvement has increased over time, but that's adaptation after the fact, not genuine co-design. Private land conservation is a major Y2Y strategy. The initiative works with landowners to establish conservation easements. That can work, but it also creates economic pressure. When surrounding land values increase due to conservation cachet and limited development, well, property taxes rise. Longtime residents, often working class, are getting priced out. That's green gentrification. It's a documented pattern in mountain communities across the Rockies. Then there's the carnivore question. This is always a complex one. Protecting wolves and grizzlies, it's a conservation win, undoubtedly. But what about the ranchers who lose livestock? What about human wildlife conflict? The economic burden falls on specific people for a benefit that's diffuse. Y2Y has developed compensation programs and wolf deterrent initiatives, but again, that's reactive. From an EJ perspective, the question is whether affected communities had genuine authority in deciding whether and how to implement carnivore protection. Now, again, Y2Y has evolved. There's now much more emphasis on Indigenous protected and conserved areas where Indigenous nations have management authority. That's progress, but this case illustrates how even well-intentioned landscape-scale conservation can reproduce power imbalances if justice isn't centered from the beginning. Another example of the inverse, an environmental justice movement that achieved conservation outcomes. The Green Belt movement in Kenya in 1977, founded by Wangari Maathai in 1977, started because rural women were walking farther and farther to find firewood and forests disappeared. Meant more labor, worse nutrition because they couldn't cook food, and degraded soil reduced crop yields. This is a serious environmental justice issue, environmental burden falling hardest on poor women. Tai's solution was to pay women to plant trees, not to create a protected area, not to restrict access, but to organize communities to restore forests in ways that directly benefited them. Women earned income from tree nurseries, communities gained firewood, food, and improved watersheds, and over 30 years, they planted more than 51 million trees. Here's what makes this interesting. Tai explicitly connected environmental degradation to political oppression. When the Kenyan government tried to build a tower in Uhuru Park, erasing Nairobi's green space, the Greenbelt movement organized mass protests. When politically connected elites grabbed public forest lands, Maathai called it out. She's been arrested multiple times. Again, this wasn't just conservation, it was democracy at work. The Greenbelt movement achieved conservation goals, in many ways economic justice, and political transformation simultaneously. That's not because Maathai found some magical sweet spot. It's because she designed from an EJ framework, where environmental restoration importantly served community needs and challenged unjust power structures. This model, as an example, challenges the assumption that conservation requires restriction and inclusion. Sometimes the path to ecological restoration is through community empowerment and economic justice. And we're seeing real movement towards integration of these frameworks, so let's be clear about what's genuine progress and what's rhetorical adaptation without structural change. The Just Transition Framework, which you may be familiar with, emerged from labor movements, but now bridges climate action, conservation, and equity. The idea is simple. Transitioning to renewable energy, sustainable economies, it shouldn't destroy livelihoods. Workers in fossil fuel industries need guaranteed employment in new sectors. Communities that relied on extractive industries need economic alternatives. That's an EJ principle applied to conservation and climate change mitigation and climate goals. The international commitment to protect 30% of land and ocean by 2030, the 30 by 30 target, now includes language about Indigenous rights and equitable governments in most official statements. That's progress, a lot of progress from the fortress conservation era. But again, language is easy. Implementation is what matters. And early data suggests many countries are pursuing 30 by 30 through, again, top-down protected areas that repeat historical fortress conservation injustices. We also see some major conservation NGOs have adopted equity principles, diversified their leadership. The Wildlife Conservation Society now has Indigenous peoples and local communities initiatives. The Nature Conservancy has equity and justice commitments. Again, that's real change in organizations that historically embodied the tensions we previously discussed. But institutional change is slow. Sometimes it blows on the wind of political change. And critics argue this is often justice washing that maintains fundamental power structures while adopting equity language by itself. The rights of nature movements, which grant legal personhood to rivers, forests, and ecosystems, it represents an interesting convergence, right? These movements are often led by Indigenous communities and use both ecological and justice arguments. If a river has legal rights, it can't be sacrificed for profit. And communities that depend on the river have legal standing to protect it. Ecuador's constitution now recognizes rights of nature. New Zealand granted legal personhood to the Wanganui River based on Maori worldviews. This is both conservation and justice, integrated from the start. Climate justice has successfully mainstreamed EJ principles into climate policy discussions. The Paris Agreement includes language about equity and differentiated responsibility. Climate adaptation funding increasingly includes justice criteria, EJ framework at global scale. But here's what hasn't changed enough: money and power. Global conservation funding still flows primarily to large international NGOs, community-based organizations. Protected area decisions are still made predominantly by government agencies and conservation professionals, not communities. When there's conflict between conservation goals and community rights, conservation interests still usually win in policy and legal outcomes. So, what does this mean? It's not just an academic debate, right? These tensions and synergies have direct implications for how you design projects, make decisions, and allocate resources. That's my goal for this course. If you're working in conservation, you need to fundamentally rethink consultation versus decision making. Consultation is when you design a project, then ask communities what they think. Decision making is when communities have authority to shape or reject the project. Those are completely different. The latter requires giving up control, and that's uncomfortable for organizations. They're used to setting priorities, but it's essential for true justice. And we're going to unpack this more in future lectures. What about the distribution of costs and benefits, right? We need to think about this rigorously. Who gets tourism revenue from a protected area? Whose losses are going to be most felt by the restrictions on access to resources? Who gets jobs? Who faces increased human wildlife conflict, right? These aren't side effects. They're central to whether this project is just. If you can't answer these questions, you may not be ready to implement. Again, you need to question the assumptions embedded in your frameworks. When you talk about wilderness, are you erasing the people who have lived there? When you set conservation priorities based purely on biodiversity value, are you implicitly devaluing places where people live? The pristine nature concept has been thoroughly critiqued by scholars like William Cronin and Ramachandra Goa, but it still shapes funding decisions and policy. We need to see change. We need to see more discourse, more thinking. Support Indigenous land rights concretely, right? If your project can't proceed without community consent, that's genuine partnership. If you can impose it despite opposition, that's colonialism with a green veneer. If you're working in EJ, you need to recognize that ecosystem destruction harms communities. Deforestation reduces air quality and increases flooding. Wetland loss decreases storm protection. Overfishing crashes local food systems. You don't have to adopt conservation framing necessarily, but ecological reality affects environmental justice outcomes without a doubt. When extractive industries threaten both communities and ecosystems, conservation groups can be powerful allies. When climate policy is being designed, bringing conservation actors into coalitions can strengthen advocacy for just transitions. For everyone, we have to get rid of the false dichotomy between people and nature. It's only harmful. Humans are part of our ecosystems. Many of the world's most diverse, biodiverse places are also home to indigenous peoples who have shaped those ecosystems. Justice and ecological health are not in opposition with each other, they're intertwined. The question is whether we structure our approaches to recognize that. So I want to close with some questions that don't have neat answers, because these are the tensions that you're going to navigate. Again, can global conservation targets like 30 by 30 coexist with community autonomy? If a community decides they'd rather develop land than conserve it, and that land is ecologically critical, well, who makes the final decision? The global community invoking planetary boundaries, or the local community invoking self-determination? It's a real conflict, and win-win rhetoric doesn't resolve it. Another question, how do we fund grassroots environmental justice work at the scale that conservation operates? Conservation can mobilize billions because it appeals to wealthy donors and fits into market mechanisms, carbon credits and conservation easements. EJ work, especially work that challenges these power structures, doesn't attract that kind of funding. Again, that's a structural barrier that we have to solve to see equity in practice. When conservation and justice genuinely conflict, not just appear to, which takes precedent? If protecting a critically endangered species requires restricting a community's resource use, and there are no alternatives that satisfy both goals, what's the ethical decision? Well, different frameworks give different answers. Who has the authority to decide land use priorities? Nations claim sovereignty. Indigenous nations claim inherent rights. International bodies invoke global commons. Local communities assert self-determination. Conservation biologists claim expertise. All of these, they have legitimacy arguments, but how do we adjudicate between them? And finally, the big one, can the economic systems we live within ever be compatible with genuine justice or meaningful conservation? Or do both movements ultimately require challenging capitalism itself? It's not a fringe question. It's increasingly the mainstream debate within this space where both fields intersect. Now, your job isn't to resolve these tensions. I certainly don't have the answers to them, but it's to navigate them with honesty about what's at stake and who bears the costs of different choices. The synthesis of conservation and EJ isn't a foregone conclusion. It's an ongoing negotiation, and you're a part of that. The outcome depends on whose voices have power in that negotiation, though. Again, we're going to look at specific mechanisms for integrating justice into conservation practice throughout this course, including participatory mapping, benefit sharing agreements, and co management structures. I'm going to give you the practical tools to implement these things, and it's not just going to be theoretical. But again, you can't implement well without understanding the underlying tensions that we've discussed today. See you next week.